At the beginning of the 20th century, in a secluded and gloomy valley, stood an imposing stone building. Its name was whispered with fear: Santa Adélia Asylum. Promising to be a refuge for the mentally ill, its doors opened with a disturbing solemnity. But from the first day, a shadow loomed over the place. The villagers nearby told stories of screams echoing on moonless nights, of lights flickering in the high windows as if they were evil eyes watching. Few dared to pass by after dark. Those who entered rarely came out. The director, Dr. Alvaro, a man with a cold smile and lifeless eyes, promised cure and treatment for the patients. But behind the facade of kindness lay boundless cruelty. Nurses and doctors were handpicked, not for their skills, but for their ability to keep secret. The asylum's corridors, always cold, were long and winding, leading to rooms where pain and suffering were constant companions. Soon, Santa Adélia gained a reputation for being more of a hell than a hospital. And so began the dark legend, a place where sanity was an unreachable privilege and madness an inevitable fate. As the reputation of the Santa Adélia Asylum spread, so did the fear among the population. Desperate families, unsure how to care for their loved ones, were easily convinced that institutionalization was the only hope. The reality was quite different. Patients were forcibly taken, dragged from their homes by brutal guards, their cries of protest echoing through the streets. Once inside the stone walls, their lives were changed forever. Unfeeling doctors with icy stares evaluated each new admission, not as a person, but as a potential experiment. Isolated in dark and damp cells, patients were stripped of their dignity and identity. They were treated like animals, given numbers instead of names, erasing any trace of their former lives. The terror came not only from the cruel treatments, from the complete absence of hope. Those who tried to resist, who still had a spark of fight, were quickly subdued by methods that could break anyone. Electric shocks, cold baths, and endless sessions of physical restraint were just the beginning. The goal was clear: to break the mind and spirit until nothing remained. And so, each new patient who entered Santa Adélia Asylum was cast into an abyss of pain and despair, where the only certainty was that the exit would be far worse than the entrance. Inside Santa Adélia Asylum, winter never ended. Cold was a constant presence, invading every room, every corridor, every cell. There was no warmth, no comfort, just the chilling reality that numbed bodies and froze the souls of the inmates. They were left without blankets, in thin and tattered clothes that barely protected them from the cutting wind blowing through the window cracks. But the cold was only part of the torture. Hunger, relentless and cruel, was a constant companion. The meals were scarce and disgusting. Thin soup with unidentifiable chunks, bread as hard as stone, and dirty water. Patients fought for scraps like starving animals, their stomachs growling in agony. Some, weaker than others, succumbed to starvation, their thin and fragile bodies becoming mere shadows of their former selves. The lack of nutrition not only weakened the bodies, but also destroyed the mind. Hunger transformed the inmates, stripping them of any trace of humanity. Glazed eyes and parched mouths became the norm as sanity slowly drained away, torn apart by despair and relentless pain. And then, as weakness took over, patients became easy targets for the doctor's macabre experiments. They were taken, one by one, to dark rooms where the true horror began. But the cold and hunger never left them, serving as a constant reminder that, in Santa Adélia Asylum, pain was eternal and salvation a cruel illusion. At Santa Adélia Asylum, diseases spread like wildfire. With constant cold and relentless hunger, the weakened bodies of the patients became fertile ground for infections and pestilence. The asylum's corridors were filled with hoarse coughs, moans of pain, and the acrid smell of disease. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and skin infections were common. Without adequate treatment, open wounds became entry points for infections that consumed the inmates from the inside out. Isolation and medical neglect exacerbated every illness, turning the place into a true death camp. But despair came not only from physical diseases. Psychological torture was an equally lethal weapon. The doctors, more interested in experimenting than healing, subjected patients to endless sessions of electroshocks, lobotomies, and other inhumane practices. The mental and emotional pain was as intense as the physical, if not worse. The screams of the tortured echoed through the stone walls but never escaped the asylum. However, the pain was not limited to the patients. The staff, initially indifferent, began to feel the weight of the atrocities they committed. Guilt and remorse gnawed at their minds, turning each day into a waking nightmare. Thus, Santa Adélia Asylum was not just a place of disease and death, but an abyss of despair where each new day brought suffering greater than the last. Santa Adélia Asylum, violence was not an exception but a rule. Patients, already weakened by cold, hunger, and disease, were subjected to unimaginable brutality. Guards and nurses, devoid of any trace of compassion, used brute force to maintain order, turning the place into a battleground where only the cruelest survived. The cries of pain became the constant soundtrack of the asylum's corridors. Inmates were beaten for any reason, or even for no reason at all. Discipline was maintained with clenched fists and wooden batons, leaving permanent scars on both the bodies and minds of those who still managed to resist. But there was an even more sinister violence in the shadows. The doctors, wearing their white coats, hid under that appearance of professionalism a cruelty without limits. Patients were selected for inhumane experiments that served only to satiate the morbid curiosity and thirst for power of those who called themselves caregivers. Each procedure was a sentence of pain and, often, death. Those who did not survive the beatings, diseases, or experiments became part of a macabre trade. Their bodies were sold to medical schools, becoming mere objects of study. The final fate of their remains was even darker. The bones were cleaned and sold, spreading the death of the asylum beyond its stone walls. And so, violence and death reigned supreme at Santa Adélia Asylum, a place where an inhumane end was not a possibility but a certainty. In the basement of Santa Adélia Asylum, far from prying eyes, clandestine market thrived in the darkness. There, the true purpose of the asylum was revealed. It was not just a place of suffering, but a profitable business where death was the most valuable commodity. The bodies of deceased patients were not simply discarded. Instead, they were carefully prepared to be sold to the region's medical schools. The asylum's doctors, with their skillful hands and stone-cold hearts, removed organs and prepared the corpses with a chilling detachment. Each body represented profit, and ethics was a word that had no place there. But the trade was not limited to fresh corpses. The bones also had their value. The skeletons, cleaned and polished, were sold to laboratories and collectors. In the silence of the early mornings, carts loaded with bones left the asylum, carrying with them the last vestiges of the tormented souls who perished there. The operation was meticulous. Patients' records were falsified, their deaths disguised as natural causes or suicides. Corruption extended beyond the asylum's walls, involving local authorities who turned a blind eye in exchange for a generous compensation. Thus, the cycle of horror and greed perpetuated itself. Those few who suspected the truth and tried to investigate mysteriously disappeared. The power of money and fear kept everyone silent. And so, Santa Adélia Asylum continued to profit from death, fueling a macabre market that turned human suffering into wealth. In this environment of darkness, where life was traded and the dead found no peace, the true nature of the asylum was revealed, a place where humanity had been completely abandoned in favor of monstrous greed. It didn't take long for the deceased patients at Santa Adélia Asylum to find a way to exact revenge. The tormented souls could not rest in peace, and the evil inflicted upon them demanded retribution. Thus, an invisible and terrifying force began to manifest in the asylum's dark corridor. First signs were subtle. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and terrifying whispers filled the air. The staff, initially skeptical, began to feel the weight of the spectral presence. Cold, once a consequence of the location, now seemed to emanate from something supernatural, chilling not just the bodies but also the souls of the living. The manifestations grew increasingly violent. Ghostly figures appeared in the corners of rooms, their empty eyes full of accusation. Nurses and doctors began to suffer mysterious accidents. Some reported feeling invisible hands choking them in their sleep, while others were pushed by unseen forces, resulting in fatal falls. Dr. Alvaro, the asylum's director who had orchestrated so many atrocities, began to be haunted by visions of the patients he had tortured. His nightmares were filled with contorted faces of pain, their accusing voices whispering in his ears. Growing increasingly paranoid, he tried to isolate himself, but there was no escaping the judgment of the dead. The spirits did not discriminate. Everyone who had participated in the asylum's cruelties was targeted for their revenge. Guards, nurses, and doctors began to go insane, haunted by the incessant screams and moans echoing in their minds. Despair took hold of everyone, and madness spread like a plague, as relentless as the diseases that had once plagued the patients. The dead were not just seeking revenge, they were seeking justice and would not stop until all responsible paid for their crimes. The Santa Adélia Asylum, once a fortress of suffering, became a stage for even deeper horrors, where the living were hunted by the ghosts of their own atrocity. As the spirit's vengeance intensified, the sanity of the Santa Adélia Asylum staff began to crumble. Each day brought new torments, and the line between reality and nightmare quickly dissolved. Those who once inflicted pain were now the victims of a force they could neither understand nor fight. Dr. Alvaro, the once ruthless director, became a prisoner of his own mind. The visions of the patients he tortured were relentless. He saw his hands covered in blood, heard the victims' screams in every corner of the asylum. Isolated in his office, he began carving indecipherable words into the walls with his nails. Desperation etched on his pale face. One night, unable to endure any longer, he threw himself from the highest tower of the building, yet his body shattering in the courtyard below. The guards and nurses, already fragile with guilt and fear, followed a similar path. One by one, they began to succumb to madness. Some were found wandering the corridors, muttering about shadows that pursued them. Others locked themselves in empty cells, preferring solitude to the incessant terror they felt around them. Suicides became a common sight, bodies hanging from the ceiling, wrists cut, poison ingested in a final act of despair. The few who tried to escape the asylum found there was no escape. The darkness seemed to follow them wherever they went. Voices whispered their names in the silence of the night, and the horrific visions continued to haunt them even outside the stone walls. Many resigned themselves to the inevitable fate, believing death was the only way out. In time, the Santa Adélia Asylum stood deserted, a grim monument to human cruelty and the vengeance of the dead. The walls, once echoing with the patients' screams, now held a deadly silence, interrupted only by the occasional sound of the wind passing through broken windows. The building, now in ruins, became a place avoided by all, a macabre reminder that the evil we do eventually comes back to haunt us. And so ends another terrifying tale of Santa Adélia Asylum, a place where human cruelty met its well-deserved retribution. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more dark tales filled with mystery and horror, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here, we explore the darkest corners of the human mind and the most haunted places you can imagine. Get ready for more terrifying tales that will send shivers down your spine and leave you wanting more. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new videos, and join us on this macabre journey. After all, there are always more dark secrets waiting to be revealed.